Welcome everyone to Daf Yomi 1 week at a time, Masechet Chagigah. This is our fourth lesson and our last lesson in this Masechet. And I'm really proud of all of you. We are finishing the Masechet today. And not only are we finishing this Masechet, but we are finishing the entire book of Moed. Again, as I mentioned last week, the Mishnah and the Gemara are divided up into 6 books. The first is Ra'im, the second is Moed. So we are finishing the second book of the Mishnah, and that includes many Masechtot, many tractates that we have learned. And today, Chagigah is the last tractate in Seder Moed, in the book of Moed, and with that we are finishing the entire section that deals with all the holidays. So, if you think back, those of you who have been learning with me for a while, so we started with Masechet Shabbat, right? Brachot is in Seder Zra'im, but Shabbat is the beginning of Seder Moed, where we learned about Shabbat, we learned Masechet Psachim, about Pesach, and Eruvin, and Shkalim, and Sukkah, and Rosh Hashanah. You have learned many Masechtot, and we are really, I think tonight is the culmination, really, of all that learning. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. Today we're going to finish up this Masechet. Again, if you remember last week, we started discussing the laws of purity and impurity. Maybe I'll put up the chart that I had last week. Here's the chart that we mentioned last week, showing the different levels of purity. It's interesting that they did it this way. It's interesting because the bottom, which is talking about sacrificial meat, right? Kodshim is sacrificial meat. It is the most susceptible to impurity, to tuma. The level just above that, the green one, which is talking about truma, things that truma that can become tameh. So we ended up last week. We started the last chapter in Chagigah, and we discussed how, in general, as you can see on this pyramid, the last, the bottom level, kachim, meaning sacrificial meat, are the most susceptible, maybe the most stringent when it comes to impurity, as opposed to truma, which is one level above. So our last week we mentioned the Mishnah at the bottom of Daf 20. We discussed that again, Kodesh is more stringent than Truma, and we had a whole list of cases. There were 10 cases that we listed where we see that sacrificial meat is more, the idea is more susceptible to impurity, and therefore more stringent. Today on Daf 21, we have a discussion in the Gemara why that is, or how that is. And the Gemara discusses the case that we started with in the Mishnah, which is that if you have one vessel inside another, can you immerse those 2 vessels in a mikvah? And the idea is, again, in general, you have to immerse vessels into a mikvah so that the water touches all parts of the vessel. What if there was a vessel one inside the other? So the Mishnah said to us that for Truma that would be okay, but for Kodesh, when we're dealing with sacrificial parts, we're going to be more stringent and not allow that type of immersion. So the Gemara suggests maybe it's because when one vessel is inside the other, it's going to block the water from touching the entire surface of the vessel. That's what's called in Hebrew a chatzitza. Chatzitza means something that interrupts the water from touching the surface. Also, the same idea was, let's say you have something that's knotted. If something is knotted, you can't put it in the mikvah because presumably where it's knotted, where it's tied together, the water won't get in to all of those areas. The Gemara tells us that these cases, that there are 10 stringencies. The first 5 deal with, again, kodesh, things that are sanctified, and chulin, again, that's mundane things that are being treated as kodesh. So just to remind us, we mentioned this last week that sometimes the people wanted to be extra careful, and they took their foods that didn't have to be very carefully guarded, right? It was what's called chulin. It's totally mundane. And they treated it as if it was kodesh, as if it was sanctified, and therefore they were very careful with that food. The Gemara says that the last 5 cases, the last 5 cases only deal with things that are actually sanctified, but not things that you are treating as sanctified. The Gemara continues and describes another option of what we're talking about. It tells us that when you have a vessel, if it needs to be open, there's basically a minimum size of a vessel that one can immerse something else in it, right? Again, we actually, if you remember, we had a case last week about immersing a needle, right? Again, I don't want to put a little needle into a big mikvah. I'm scared it's going to get lost. So I want to put it into something smaller. So the Gemara says that if there's a vessel, the opening of that vessel has to be at least 2 fingers wide. And then if the vessel is at least 2 fingers wide, then you can immerse a needle in that vessel when you put it into the mikvah. The Gemara uses the same idea to say that you can connect a kosher mikvah, right, a mikvah that is a certain size, to a mikvah that is not kosher, in the sense that it's not the minimum size or the water is not the exact water that you need. If you connect it with a tube that's at least 2 fingers wide, that makes the both bodies of water able to immerse in, which, by the way, is actually the way we have mikvahs nowadays. So maybe just I'll take a moment to explain. We're supposed to immerse in what's called mayim chayim, which means living water. That means water that is either rainwater or spring water. Most people don't have springs next to their house, and if they do, the springs are generally cold, so that's not always a fun immersing experience. So what do people do? If you've been to when we go to the mikvah, that water that we're actually immersing in is actually water that came out of the tap. That's not kosher mikvah water. But what do? We have a pool of water that's rainwater. We connect it with a pipe to, an open pipe to the mikvah that we are going to immerse in. We fill that mikvah water up with regular clean water from the tap that's usually heated, it's filtered, and because it's connected to the rainwater, that becomes a kosher mikvah. So that's actually referred to in our Gemara at the bottom of Daf 21. Daf 22 tells us that, again, we were talking about vessels inside one another. So the Gemara tells us on Daf 22 that you can fill up a wicker basket with other vessels in it and immerse them together. Again, the difference here is that a wicker basket has holes in it, and the water is going to get in and touch all of the vessels. Some say that that is okay. Some say that it's not okay. Um, Another way to interpret our case of the vessel inside another vessel is that the outer vessel has to be pure to begin with. And then you can put, um, but if it's impure, even if the opening is less than 2 millimeters, than 2 fingers, it is actually okay to immerse them together, because the idea is that the outer vessel is going to be purified, and as it's being purified, it will also purify the things that are in the inside. Some say that you can use a wicker basket as the outer vessel only if you're immersing the vessels for truma. But if you're immersing the vessels for um, kodesh, for sanctified things, then it's not okay. Here we have the discussion of a chaver. So to remind us, a chaver, the word actually means a friend, but chaver means someone who is very meticulous when it comes to the laws of purity and impurity. So the chaver is always going to be careful and trustworthy. The other person that we're talking about in this Gemara is called an Am Haaretz. The words mean, right, part of the nation of the land, right? There are different explanations of what this means. Does it mean ignorant? Does it mean less observant? Does it mean non-observant? Does it mean less careful? It's not clear. We have different implications at different places in the Gemara. Here, especially in the case of talking about impurity, meaning tum'ah and tahara, I think the idea here is that the Am Haaretz is someone who is not careful about their belongings, about their clothing. They don't care. Again, if it's neglect, if it's ignorance, I'm not exactly sure. But the idea is that they're not careful about impurity, and therefore we assume that their things are impure because in the course of one's lifetime, you touch dead things, you come in contact with different bodily fluids. Again, the chaver is going to be very careful. The Am Haaretz is less careful. What's interesting is that, especially in this Masechet, when we're talking about unity of the Jewish people and people coming together again to celebrate the festival, we will see that there are some leniencies when dealing with these two groups of people. We don't want, right, the Gemara actually tells us on Daf 22, we do not want animosity between the chaver and the Am Haaretz, right? Even though one is very careful, the other is less careful. We don't want animosity, and therefore we will and therefore we will accept certain things from the Am Haaretz, but not everything. So when we're dealing with Kodesh, with things that are sanctified, either the idea is that the Am Haaretz will be much more careful, and therefore we trust them, and we share different vessels, or the idea is that when everybody's going to Jerusalem, again, there's this idea of unity specifically in Jerusalem. And therefore the Gemara continues and says that we accept wine and oil in the temple from an Am Haaretz. Again, the assumption was that the Am Haaretz, when they touch things, they're going to make it impure. But if they go out of their way to bring things to Jerusalem to sanctify it for the temple, we trust them to say that this is pure. What about borrowing vessels? Right? Can you borrow a vessel from the Am Haaretz? What is its status? So the Gemara says you can borrow again, these vessels. Earthenware vessels. So it's very interesting to understand that in those days, earthenware vessels many times were seen as disposable. What does that mean? You took earthenware vessels, you used them, let's say, for sanctified food. Now that has a very high level of sanctity, you're not allowed to use it for anything else. What would you do? You would break it, right? You break it. Then what happens? Someone can take that, right? You ground it up, it becomes dirt again, right? You mix it with water, it becomes clay again, right? So it's interesting to think that in the time of the temple, right? Again, anyone who's ever seen an archaeological site or has been, let's say, to the Israel Museum, there are a lot of pottery shards, especially around the temple, right? Because they would break these vessels so that nobody would use them afterwards. Also, if they become impure, the only thing you can do with them is break them. Again, you could repair them afterwards and use them again. If you have an earthenware vessel and it is sealed, and the Gemara explains how it is sealed. It's a double seal. It's called samid petil, which means that it's basically like stopped up, like sealed, like you put something in the top, and then you seal it around the opening. So that double seal will prevent the tuma, the impurity, from going inside the vessel, and the contents of the vessels remain pure, whether they're liquid or solid. And therefore, you can borrow different vessels from an Am Haaretz. Some say you need to immerse them first, again, because we're concerned that they are impure. We trust the Am Haaretz to say that he isn't impure from a dead body, right? Again, the top of our pyramid here, that is the highest or the most stringent type of impurity. We trust the Am Haaretz to say whether or not they are impure from contact with a dead body, but not about, right, this is about the person, but not about their items, their kelim, their vessels. Again, the assumption is that they're not so careful with their vessels and they don't watch them all the time and they're not really sure. They're trusted about their fruit, but they're trusted to say if their fruit is able or susceptible to become impure, but not trusted to say if it is pure or not. Again, they could have left their produce unattended and they don't really know what happened. Okay, back to our vessels. We said that the outside of the vessel can become impure, and the rim and the inside can remain pure, right? It's interesting that in certain cases you can actually split the different surfaces of the utensil. But if the inside of the utensil becomes impure, that means everything is seen as tameh, as impure. Handles are separate from the rest of the vessel. Again, if you think about, a jug with two handles or a pot where it might have one handle, those are seen as separate from the vessel in terms of truma. Again, this third level. But when we're dealing with Kodesh, where we want to be extra careful, we're going to say the handle is not seen as separate. Therefore, if someone who is impure touched the handle of a vessel, the entire vessel is now impure in relation to Kodesh, sanctified food. Okay, the Gemara continues on Daf 23 and tells us about what about carrying something that has purity, right? It's something that we want to maintain purity. And there's a story that somebody was carrying in one hand or, in one area, something that was impure, and in the other area, something that needed to remain pure, meaning something kadosh, sanctified. And there was an incident of a person who was carrying this barrel of sanctified wine, and his sandal broke, and he put the sandal on top of the barrel, and the sandal that was impure fell in, and it made everything impure. And therefore, they made a decree, right, a gezerah, a decree that you're not allowed to carry something that is impure with kodesh, with something that is sanctified. The story happens with kodesh, again with this highest level. Therefore, the decree is only about kodesh. It's not with truma or anything else that I'm concerned if it would get impure. Okay, excuse me, sorry. Another example of a decree that was based on a specific incident and not extended to related cases was that a person was transporting the water with the ashes of the red heifer, of the para aduma. This is like the highest level and the most susceptible to impurity. And he was transporting it on a boat in the Jordan. And then he found out that there was impurity in the boat, and it messed up, this very special water. And therefore, there was a decree that you cannot transport the water with the ashes in a boat on the Jordan, but you can carry it over a bridge or in a carriage, but the decree was specifically based on this case. There's a machloket, a disagreement, let's say, again, we said you're not supposed to carry these two things together. Again, the assumption is they're not touching, but you're carrying it together. You're not supposed to do it lest they touch each other. So there's a machloket. What happens if you do anyway, either by accident or on purpose? Does the item automatically become impure or not? Right? There are both opinions in the Gemara. Daf 23 continues and talks about when someone makes a vessel, you make a bowl or a cup. The idea is that when you finish making the cup or any vessel, you need to immerse it in the mikvah before using it for kodesh, before using it for sanctified food. So the Gemara tells us that if a chaver, again, that's the person who is very careful, if the chaver finished making the vessel, we're concerned that maybe an am haaretz came by and maybe some of his spit went on this vessel, and therefore you have to immerse it in the mikvah. What about the same idea? What about a reed that they would cut and they would use it to hold the ashes of the red heifer, of the para aduma? Again, we say that a chaver, again, is the one who cut it, but maybe an am haaretz, right, spit on it, near it, again, accidentally or on purpose. We don't know, but we have to, again, be very careful and immerse it before we use it for the ashes. Here's just a side point, but a very interesting one. Sorry. The Gemara discusses the difference between I would say the observant Jews and the sectarians. We mentioned this, I think, last time that we mentioned the Tzdukim who were a sect of Judaism when they started, but at the end were not considered Jews. But basically, they were a sect that only followed the written Torah, but not the oral Torah. They did not believe in rabbinic authority, and therefore they misinterpreted numerous things. And we'll see throughout the Gemara that there were things that were done in order to make sure that the Jews that were doing these actions were observant Jews and not part of a sect. They were not sectarian. So we saw that last week in terms of Shavuot. Here we have the same thing, a similar idea with the para aduma, with the red heifer, that the prushim, meaning the observant Jews, said that the ceremony could be done by a person who, again, obviously, as we said, the ashes are very susceptible to impurity. But according to the oral law, the person who is dealing with these ashes is allowed to he was allowed to have been impure that morning, went to the mikvah, and now he's allowed to come in contact with the ashes and the water of the red heifer, the para aduma. The tzdukim said no. This person who was impure in the morning and then went to the mikvah, you have to wait till sunset for that person to be completely pure, which is true, but the prushim said it's okay. That person can deal with these ashes. The tzdukim said no, and therefore they were very careful to make sure that distinction was made. Okay, the next idea is at the top of Daf 24, the concept that a vessel unites everything that is in it. Meaning, even if the things aren't touching each other, the fact that they're in the same vessel, they are seen as if they're touching, which means that if a person touches, right, let's say you have a bowl of apples, even if they're not touching each other, and a person who is impure touches one apple, with regard to kodesh, to sanctified food, that everything is seen as impure. That is not the case for lesser levels of impurity. So that's just important to understand. And the Gemara continues and talks about someone who again went to the mikvah. Let's say somebody has to, let's say a zav or someone who gave birth, right? You go to the mikvah, and the next day you bring a sacrifice. That person, even though they went to the mikvah when they needed to go, the next day after they bring their sacrifice, if they want to eat from that sacrifice, they need to go to the mikvah again because they weren't in the mindset of making sure that they are fully pure. And again, a lot of this has to do with awareness. Were you aware if you came in contact with impurity? Okay, let's talk about hands. In general, as we mentioned before, right, if one part of your body touches a dead body, your entire body becomes tameh. You in your entirety are impure. The rabbis decreed another level of impurity that is talking about the hands. And the rabbis decreed that, let's say you touch something not that is directly impure, but something that's, let's say, indirectly impure, your hands must be purified before you touch that object. Right? We see this when we wash our hands for bread. Right? Why do we wash our hands for bread? It's based on truma. It used to be that challah, right? You took challah and you would give some of it, a portion of it, to the priest. That challah that the priest received is called truma, and the priest needed to make sure that he was pure before he ate from the truma. Generally, the priests were very careful about the laws of impurity and purity, and they would be very careful. But we want to make sure that when the regular person takes off the challah to give to the priest, that um, that they are doing it with purity, and therefore there was a decree that anybody who is going to eat bread needs to wash their hands before eating bread. The idea is that you're purifying your hands. Again, on a rabbinic level, not on a biblical level. Again, if someone needs to purify themselves on a biblical level, you need to go to the mikvah, right? Washing your hands doesn't help in that situation. But here we're talking about rabbinically imposed impurity, and therefore it's enough to wash your hands again in a certain way. So the Gemara tells us that here this is an interesting idea that if one hand touches something that is impure on a rabbinic level, and then it touches the other hand, does it make it impure or not? And that is a whole machloket, a disagreement on Daf 24, that maybe it does. Maybe your one hand needs to be holding the other hand when this hand touches something that's impure, and that's how it's connected. So there's a whole discussion about different degrees of impurity and how they are passed down. Another idea is that wet hands can transmit more than dry, right? If your hand is dry, maybe it is less contaminating. Again, I don't like that word because it makes it sound dirty or bad, right? This is not about dirt or bad or right or good, right? We're talking about purity and impurity. It's the circle of life. It's not good or bad. Okay. The Gemara continues and talks about. Let's go to the next Mishnah on Daf 24, at the bottom of Daf 24. Here, again, till now we were saying that Kodesh, which is sanctified food, is on a higher level than Truma. Now the Mishnah tells us that there are cases where Truma is going to be more stringent than Kodesh. What are the cases? You trust anyone in the area of Yehuda, right? That is the area of Jerusalem and south of Jerusalem. I live in the area of Yehuda. So the Mishnah tells us that you trust anyone in Yehuda all year round with things that are being processed for the temple, basically things that are going to be sanctified, wine and oil, right? Again, this region of Yehuda has a lot of grapes, a lot of olives, and they were using, right, if anybody has been to the area around Jerusalem, especially Gush Etzion where I live, you can see vineyards, there are wineries here, you can see olive groves where they pressed olives for oil, right? All of these things could be brought to the temple. So we trust everybody from this region about Kodesh, right? Because again, the idea, if you're making something for the temple, you are going to be very careful. And during the pressing season, you're even trusted about Truma. So it sounds like Truma is on a higher level. After the pressing season, you are not trusted, but you can store it till the next pressing season, and then everything is believed. The top of Daf 25 tells us that you're trusted about your jugs of wine and oil, especially if they're like mixed together. I don't think in the same barrel. I think, together in a group. Even if it's 70 days before the pressing, the pressing season, the season when they're pressing wine or, I should say, pressing grapes or olives to make wine and oil. The Gemara says that we're talking about the area of Yehuda, of Judah, but not the Galil, right? The Galil is in the north. There was an assumption that people were less careful in the northern regions of Israel. There are some nations that are in between, right, the northern area of Jerusalem and Jerusalem. And because there are non-Jews in the middle, there's kind of this distance, literally, and figuratively. So the Gemara tells us that the Galil is not trusted because the Kutim, right, live in this area, and their graves that are going to be in the area between the Galil, the north, and Jerusalem, and therefore, if they bring these jugs of oil or wine to Jerusalem, we're scared that they're going to become impure on the road as they're traveling. So then the Gemara suggests, wait a minute, why don't you just put it in a box and carry it, and then it won't become impure? And then there's a whole discussion if that does protect from impurity or not. And really, the Gemara says, it concludes that there's no really good way to bring these sanctified items to Jerusalem from the north, and therefore you have to wait for Eliyahu, again the prophet Elijah, to come and to show them, kind of the path, so that they do not pass over any graves. Which is interesting. Someone actually sent me an email asking, how long do you think that they might have set these jugs aside? Like, how long were they waiting for Eliyahu? Which is an interesting idea. Okay, everybody is believed in the regular pressing season, again in Yehuda, but not late season, meaning in the regular season, not in a late season. Or they're not trusted in the Galil, again in the north, but in Yehuda they are, or they're both the north and the south are trusted when it is pressing season, and then there's a distinction when it is not. Again, as we said, we trust the Am Haaretz when we're dealing with Truma, but not... we say that the Kohen, the priest, can't take it after pressing season. Again, where they're believed when it's basically production time, but when it's not production time, they're not believed. But again, we said you can hold it till the next season. Okay. If you remember, we had a concept, an area called a Beit HaPras. This is a field where they think there's a grave somewhere, but it's been plowed and you don't know where it is. If you're going to Jerusalem to bring the sacrifice of Pesach, right, the Korban Pesach, you can check it for bones and therefore make your way through this field, but you can't check it for Truma. Again, we see that Truma seems to be much more stringent. Right? How do you check it? Either you blow on it, or if a number of people have already trampled it, it's seen as already checked. Okay. We mentioned that if you have a mixture of things that are sanctified and things that aren't, we do trust the Am Haaretz, but we don't if it has to do with Truma. Again, making a distinction between Truma and Kodesh. Okay, the next Mishnah tells us, okay, so just to understand, the Gemara is going to explain it in a minute, but you were not allowed to produce pottery in Jerusalem. The idea is that a kiln, all right, those of you who are familiar with pottery making, at the end of the process, you have to fire the clay so that it becomes hardened. The fire from the kiln was very hot, and there was a lot of smoke. One idea is that maybe the smoke was very black, and they didn't want to ruin the walls of Jerusalem, or the idea is that it created a lot of smoke, and they didn't want it to get mixed up with the Ktoret, the incense, and therefore you were not allowed to produce clay vessels in Jerusalem. And therefore, if someone needed a clay vessel, meaning you needed a pot, a pan, a dish, where did you get it? Outside of Jerusalem. So the Gemara tells us that from Modi'in, and this is great because there is a city nowadays called Modi'in. It is, I would say, about a 40-minute drive from Jerusalem. It's near the airport. So the Gemara said, the Gemara says that from Modi'in to Jerusalem, that area, the potters are believed that their vessels are pure. Again, these are sellers that want to sell to any pilgrims that are coming, who need purified vessels for all of their sacrificial food. And therefore, we believe them in this area. Outside of the area, they are not believed, again, because we assume that they're not being very careful. If the potter is from outside of the area, if he is entering the area, so then he is believed when he says that his things are pure, and his pots as well. What about Modi'in itself, right? The city itself, is it seen as like in this area or out? And the Gemara basically says both. Right, if the potter is coming from inside, let's say from Jerusalem to Modi'in, and a person is coming into the area from outside, let's say from Tel Aviv, that person can buy pottery in Modi'in for his pilgrimage or her pilgrimage to Jerusalem. But if both the potter and the consumer are coming from outside, or they're both coming from inside, then Modi'in is seen as outside of that area. They need to wait till they get further in to buy these pots. Again, these are small pots. Again, the top of 26 tells us this is only for empty small pots. Again, pans, pots, vessels, plates, or maybe a little bit bigger. Maybe even if they have something inside, they are believed. Again, we're going to try to make things easy or easier for people going to Jerusalem. The next Mishnah on Daf 26, we're now at the end of a Masechet. We're going to get some very quick Mishnayot. So the Mishnah tells us that a tax collector and a robber that is returning stolen items, meaning a tax collector who comes into your house and rummages through your house to take a tax, or a robber who came and stole something from your house and then they come and return it, these people are believed to say they didn't touch, let's say, the inside of the item, or they didn't touch items in the house that they didn't take. The Gemara says that in Jerusalem, everyone is believed about Kodesh, again, about sanctified food. And during the festivals, they're even believed about Truma. Again, we want to believe as many people as possible. The Gemara explains this idea about the tax collector, what's going on. Basically, the idea is that when the tax collector came, this was actually a Jew. If he had a non-Jew with him, we assume he went through your house and touched everything. If there's a Jew if there isn't a non-Jew with him, then he's believed to say, I only took what I needed. Everything else I didn't touch. What about these robbers? How do we trust a robber? They actually just came in and stole something from your house. The Gemara says they have repented, right? They did tshuva, and that's why they're returning the item. And therefore, not only that, but they are believed to say that they didn't touch the inside of the item. And the Gemara says, back to this idea of the festival, during festival times, we assume that everybody, I shouldn't say we assume, the rabbi said we characterize everybody as if they are a chaver, and therefore everyone is trusted to say that they have immersed, trusted to say that they are pure, that their vessels are pure. The Gemara, the next Mishnah tells us that if you have an open barrel of wine or some bread at the end of a festival, you can continue selling it after the festival, even though maybe it became impure over the festival. Or the other option is that you cannot continue to sell it because we assume that it became impure and now you cannot use it. Maybe you can save it for the next festival. Others say you cannot. The next Mishnah tells us that they needed to purify everything in the temple after the festival. Again, the assumption is there are people coming from all walks of life, all levels of observance. During the festival, we see everything as being pure. After the festival, we say, look, I don't know who touched what. Let's immerse everything and start from scratch. And therefore, they would immerse everything. But if the festival ended on a Thursday, on Friday, again, you're getting ready for Shabbat. They had a lot of other things to do, and therefore they didn't need to purify the entire temple on the Friday. They could wait till Sunday. The next Mishnah tells us that they would immerse all the vessels of the temple. They made sure not to touch the shulchan, the table with the showbread, because that was problematic to immerse, and therefore they wanted to make sure that it did not become impure. The Mishnah tells us that all vessels in the temple, meaning the shovels, the pails, the spoons, all of those things had replacements. So if something became impure, there would be a second or a third one that you could use. The altars, right? There are two altars in the temple. The one in the courtyard that's called either the stone altar or the copper altar, and the altar on the inside, which was gold for the incense. Both of those could not become impure. They are seen as attached to the ground, or maybe they couldn't become impure because they were coated. And we'll discuss this in a minute. The Gemara says that both the menorah, right, the candelabrum, and the shulchan, the table, cannot be removed to be immersed, and therefore you shouldn't touch it because we're afraid it's going to become impure. Wooden vessels, right, the shulchan, the table is really wood, but it was covered in gold. So the question is, do we see it as a wood utensil, and a wood utensil that's not meant to be moved does not become tameh, or do we see it as a gold utensil, and a gold utensil can become impure? So the Gemara says, no, the table was moved. It was lifted and shown to the people during the festival. They showed the miraculousness of the showbread, of the lechem hapanim, right? What was the miracle of this bread? That it was put in on Friday. It was baked on Friday. It was put on the table, on the shulchan, on Shabbat, and it stayed there a whole week. The next Shabbat, when they removed it, it was hot and fresh, just like it was when they put it in a week ago. So that's the miraculous nature of the bread. And therefore, the Gemara talks about the idea that it can be moved. However, right, the top of Daf 27, again, this is our last Daf of Masechet Chagigah. The last Daf tells us that the shulchan, right, the table was actually called a wooden table. Even though it was covered in gold, it wasn't seen as a golden table, it was seen as a wood table. And therefore it is susceptible to impurity. Therefore you have to be careful not to touch it. A beautiful idea, the Gemara tells us that the altar gave people atonement during the time of the temple. But nowadays that we do not have the temple, where do we get atonement? The Gemara tells us from our tables, right? When we feed the needy, when we bring in guests, that is a way for us to atone for our sins, right? There's a concept that our tables are like the altar, right? There's a famous idea that you're not supposed to sit on a table, specifically tables that you eat at, because it's as if you're sitting on the altar. Again, that comes from this idea that the table has become the altar. And from here, there's a discussion about the copper altar and the gold altar. Both of them are compared to the earth, and therefore they are not susceptible to impurity. The last two ideas, if you look at the end of a Masechet, usually, and definitely at the end of a Seder, there's usually an idea, I would say less legal, less about Jewish law, and more about, I would say, lessons for our life, or a message or a moral. So the Masechet ends by telling us two things. One is that the fire of Gehenom, again of hell, doesn't affect Torah scholars. Why does the fire not affect Torah scholars? Because the Torah scholar fills themselves, you fill yourself up with the fire of Torah, right? Again, the words of Torah are like fire. So if you fill yourself with godly fire, the fires of Gehenom cannot affect you, right? And I think this is such a beautiful idea for all of you who have been learning every week or every day, this idea that we are filling ourselves up with the words of Torah, and these should be, kind of a fire within us. So that's, I thought, a beautiful idea. The second idea is that the fire of Gehenom doesn't affect the sinners of Israel. What does it mean it doesn't affect the sinners of Israel? It's learned from the golden altar, right? That's the connection here. What does that mean? It says that the golden altar had a very thin layer of gold on it, but the fire that burnt didn't damage the altar itself. So if you can see, this thin layer of gold protects the entire altar from fire. So too, the mitzvot, right? All of our good deeds protect us from the fire of Gehenom. And a beautiful idea here is they're called the sinners of Israel. What does that mean? That even the sinners of Israel are filled with good deeds, right? And I think that that's a very important lesson for people, right? People think that if you do something wrong, that's it. I'm doomed. And I think here the Gemara is telling us, no, you did one thing wrong, and maybe you did 10 things right. It's 1 out of 10. You've done 10 amazing things, and focus on the positive. And with that, we finish Masechet Chagigah. I think that there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from this Masechet. I think, one idea that I'm taking away from it is this idea of the unity of the Jewish people, right? The idea that 3 times a year, the Jewish people needed to come to Jerusalem. They needed to come together. They needed to interact with each other. And that was a way to unify the nation. And I think that our challenge is to really think about, how do we do this nowadays, right? How do we unite one another? How do we get together? I think, on a small scale, it's about, maybe seeing one another on the holidays, getting together. I think nowadays with Zoom, it's much easier, right? We're connecting all across the world. But really, I think this idea of unifying the Jewish people through Torah, through religious experiences, is a very powerful message. And I really wish all of you, first of all, kol hakavod, congratulations to everybody who has learned really so intensely over the past, first of all, month, and second of all, almost 2 years plus. So really keep going. The next Masechet is Masechet Yevamot. We are going to be in the Seder of Nashim, which means women. We are going to be discussing issues pertaining to women. Of course, they're pertaining to men and women, but it's called Nashim. You know, I guess women are just so important. The whole Seder is called Nashim. We're going to specifically be starting the Masechet of Yevamot. It is seen as one of the hardest Masechtot in Gemara, but don't worry. I don't like when teachers say, you know, good luck, it's going to be so hard. It'll be hard and it'll be fine. So I really encourage all of you to please continue learning. Please make sure to register for the next Masechet. And next week, I will be giving an introduction as well as we will learn the first 7 daf together. I hope I'll be able to condense it all in an hour, but really wishing everybody a really wonderful week. And we'll meet again next week, so I don't have to say Purim Sameach, because we will do that. We will do that next week. Lynn is asking on International Women's Day. We read the first line. You want to read the first line of the next Mishnah? Is that what you mean? Yeah. We can. Yeah, sure. Okay, hold on. Let me open up my my Gemara. 1 second. And yeah, that's an excellent idea. First of all, it is customary that when you learn, when you have a Siyum, you should right away learn the next idea. So you are 100% correct, Lynn. So let us learn. Okay. Okay, we'll learn the first line. I don't want to get into any details because we didn't do any of the introduction. But the Mishnah tells us that there are 15 women that exempt their co-wives from needing yibum. So I'll just explain 1 minute since we have 1 minute. Yibum is what's called, I think in English, levirate marriage. But the idea is that if there is, if a man dies, a married man dies without leaving any children, his wife, his widow, needs to marry one of his brothers. Again, all of this means that he has to have brothers. If he doesn't have brothers, she doesn't have to marry them because he doesn't have any. If they have children, she doesn't have to marry them. We're going to see that again in the times of the Gemara. A man was allowed to be married to numerous women, and therefore we're going to see that only one of the wives needs to marry the brother, and as soon as that happens, all the other co-wives are now free to marry whoever they want. Just an interesting idea is that in the Gemara or in the Mishnah, the co-wife, I think in the Mormons, right? They call them sister wives. So in the Mishnah, it's actually the opposite. It's called a tzara. The word tzara means problem, right? Meaning co-wives are generally, they don't all live happily ever after, and therefore they're actually referred to as tsarot, as problematic to each other. But basically, the Mishnah or the Gemara is going to describe different women that are not obligated to do yibum. And we're going to get through all of these very intricate and exciting different women. There are 15 of them, and we will learn about them next week. So yes, happy International Women's Day. Kol hakavod to all our women learners, and really wishing everybody a wonderful week. Shavua tov and Shabbat shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi.